I didn't start out looking for a war. I started out looking for a story. That's how most catastrophic decisions begin, in my experience. Not with heroism, not with a soldier's resolve, but with a journalist's itch. Someone says something that doesn't add up. Someone else cuts the feed. A box arrives in the mail when it shouldn't, and the man who opened it calls you instead of the authorities because he doesn't know who the authorities are anymore. You tell yourself it's just a piece. You tell yourself you'll be home by Thursday. I wasn't home by Thursday. I wasn't home for a long time. My name is Matt Corvin. I was a documentary journalist before all this. Regional stuff, mostly. Civic corruption, environmental litigation, the slow-motion disasters that chew through small towns without anyone in a major market caring enough to look. I was 36 years old. I drove a truck with a cracked dashboard, and I kept my gear in 2 padded cases I'd owned since film school. None of that matters now. It mattered then. It was the whole of my life, then. And I want you to understand that before I tell you what I found under the Louisiana swamp, because the man who walked into that hatch was a different species of person than the one who walked out. Not metaphorically. I mean that in the most literal sense I know how to construct. My partner was Sam Mayer. He'd been my second camera since our 3rd year of working together, which is the kind of partnership that stops needing explanation. We communicated in shorthand. He knew when I was about to push a subject too hard, and he knew how to pull the wide shot before I asked. He was from the coast originally. Big shoulders, quiet mouth. He laughed rarely, and when he did, it was the real kind. I want you to remember him that way. Before what happened to him in that harness. Before the hospital visit. Before the look that settled into his eyes like sediment. The story came to us through George Larson. George ran a late-night radio program out of Baton Rouge. The kind of show that occupied the 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. slot, which tells you everything about its intended audience. Conspiracy callers, insomniacs, truckers on I-10. George was a decent man who'd lost his network job in a round of cuts, and landed here because the alternative was silence. And George was constitutionally incapable of silence. Calls. He aired them. He applied a thin veneer of skepticism that nobody, including him, fully believed. On the night in question, 12 days before the event I'll describe later, which is the event that changed everything, a man called George's program and identified himself as a communications technician employed at a restricted government installation. He didn't say Area 51. He said the name of the installation in a way that made George later describe it as the most afraid I have ever heard a human voice sound. The caller said that for the past 11 months he had been reading transmissions. Not transmissions from foreign governments. Not signals from satellites. Transmissions from the moon. Specifically, from a point on the lunar far side that corresponded to no mapped feature, no crater designation, nothing in any public database he'd been able to access. The caller said, "They're not aliens. That's what I need you to understand. They're not from somewhere else. They're from here. They're from us. They're from what we become." Then the call was cut. George sat with that for 3 days. He told me later he spent those 3 days trying to convince himself it was a hoax, which is the rational response. And the rational response almost held. Then the box arrived. It came by ordinary courier. No return address. Postmarked from a city in Mississippi that George couldn't find on any map. Inside, a photo album, the physical kind, the kind with magnetic pages and a cardboard cover. Photographs were Polaroids, most of them. They showed buildings, architecture that made no immediate sense, curves where there should be angles, materials that caught light wrong, corridors that seemed to continue beyond the frame's edges in a way that felt geometrically dishonest. People moved through these spaces, wearing clothes that were recognizable, but not quite contemporary. Styles that didn't match any decade George could place. One photograph showed a man in a blazer and slacks standing in what appeared to be an underground chamber, smiling at the camera with the relaxed confidence of someone being documented rather than surveilling. On the back of this photograph in careful handwriting, a string of numbers. George decoded the numbers as GPS coordinates. He was not a technical man, but he knew enough. The coordinates placed a location in the Atchafalaya Basin, swampland, less than an hour from his studio. He called me because he'd seen our work, and because he didn't know who else to call, and because, he admitted, He was afraid to go alone. I agreed to take the job because the numbers were real and because I have never successfully talked myself out of a story that had real numbers in it. We left before dawn. George rode in the cab with me and navigated from a printed sheet he'd double-checked twice the night before. Fist Sand slept in the back seat with his equipment bag for a pillow. The basin opened around us as the light came up. Spanish macices spalled cypress, black water catching the first gray of morning, the smell of mud and usted vegetation and something older underneath all of it. Some mineral patience that the swamp had been practicing since before anyone put a name on it. I have been in a lot of places in pursuit of a lot of stories. Petrochemical plants at midnight, courthouses during verdicts that nobody wanted, neighborhoods where the industry left and nothing came after. I have learned to read the mood of a place before I get out of the truck. The mood of the Atchafalaya Basin at dawn was the mood of a place that had no opinion about you whatsoever, that would absorb your presence or your absence with equal indifference, that had been here before you and would be hereafter, and that did not find this worth mentioning. It was not threatening. It was simply older than the concept of threat. George had printed the coordinates onto 2 separate sheets in case he lost one. He had also printed a physical map of the basin, downloaded from a geological survey site, with the coordinates marked in red ink. He held this map with the careful attention of a man who has decided that his reliability as a navigator is the one thing he can contribute to a situation that is otherwise outside his competence. He was, I realized, frightened. He had been frightened since the box arrived at his station and had been managing it by staying useful, which is the only functional response to fear that I've found in 20 years of going places where reasonable people don't go. Coordinates led us to a property that wasn't on any register we'd checked. A boatyard owner named Arte Guidry met us at the edge of his property with the expression of a man who'd been expecting trouble and had decided to cooperate because the alternative was worse. He told us he didn't know what was under his land. He told us he'd heard things at night, equipment sounds, machinery. He told us a man had come to him 2 years prior and paid him in cash to keep his boats on the north side of the property and to stop asking questions about the south side. He took us to the south side. He left us there without explanation. He walked back to his boat shed and didn't look back. I respected that. The hatch was set into a low concrete pad that had been grown over with grass, skillfully enough to be invisible from 20 yards. The lock was a type I'd never seen, not mechanical, not digital in any familiar sense, but responsive to a specific pressure pattern on the frame itself, which George discovered by accident when he leaned against it. The hatch opened inward. Below was a shaft with a ladder. I want to tell you that we hesitated. We did hesitate. We stood at the top of that shaft for a full 4 minutes, in the growing morning heat, listening to the silence from below, which was not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room that has stopped its processes out of deference to the listeners. Sand looked at me. I looked at George. George looked at the hatch. We went down. The facility below was large. Not impossibly large, not a cathedral, not an aircraft hangar. Large in the way that surprises you when the exterior gave no indication of it. When everything above ground was ordinary grass and bayou and the smell of water. The walls were poured concrete but overlaid in sections with a material I couldn't identify. Smooth, faintly warm to the touch. Slightly translucent in the way that certain grades of industrial polycarbonate are translucent but heavier. And with a different quality of surface that made me think of something grown rather than manufactured. The lighting was embedded, ambient, coming from no visible source. A cool blue-white that felt clean in a way that fluorescents never do. I counted 3 distinct chambers as we moved through. The first was the largest, maybe 60 feet across, circular, with ceiling height that the ladder hadn't prepared us for, 15 feet at least. The floor was a single poured surface, seamless, slightly convex at the center in a way that directed any water toward a drain ring at the perimeter. The second chamber was smaller, roughly rectangular, connected by a corridor that curved in a way that felt deliberate rather than architectural. A curve that made you slow down before you could see what was ahead of it, which is the design logic of people who take security seriously at a level below conscious planning. The third chamber was the deepest, accessed through a second ladder drop of perhaps 12 feet, and it was here that the remaining warmth in the walls was strongest, as though the material retained the memory of whatever processes had once run here. George filmed everything. San filmed everything. Kept my hands free because the feeling in that space, the specific quality of the silence, which was the silence of evacuated machinery rather than empty rooms, made me want my hands free. I have spent time in decommissioned industrial facilities. I know what they feel like. This felt like a decommissioned industrial facility that had been decommissioned by people who intended to return and had not yet returned. And the distinction matters in a way I couldn't have articulated at the time, but felt in the back of the neck. The facility was mostly stripped. Whoever had cleared it had done a thorough job. Shelving units remained but held nothing. Cable trays ran along the ceiling but ended in bare terminals. Work surfaces stood clean. It had the feeling of a building evacuated not in emergency, but in careful, methodical withdrawal. Someone who'd had time to do the job properly, and had done it. Only in the far corner of the deepest room did we find anything left behind. It was a harness. Roughly the size and configuration of a tactical vest, but constructed of that same warm material as the wall panels, laced with a circuitry I couldn't resolve. Not printed circuits, not wiring in any conventional sense, but channels within the material itself, faintly luminous where they ran beneath the surface. At the center of the harness, seated in a cradle of the same material, was a stone. Not a stone, really, a crystal, flee the size of a large man's fist. Green, not the green of glass or gemstone, but a living green, a green that suggested interior processes rather than surface reflection, the way bioluminescent organisms suggest light rather than display it. San picked up the harness. He is the kind of man who handles things, equipment, problems, physical situations, before he thinks them all the way through. Put it on over his shirt, because that's what you do when you find a vest. You see if it fits. It fit. He activated it by accident. A pressure point on the left side of the cradle, his hand brushing it while he adjusted the shoulder strap. Crystal pulsed once hard green light, flooding the room for a fraction of a second. Sand disappeared. Not faded. Not fell. Not collapsed. Disappeared. Present and then not between one frame and the next, with no intermediate state. He was back in 4.3 seconds. I know the time because San's camera was running, and I counted frames later. 4.3 seconds. He came back in the same position he'd been standing, but wrong. The angles of his body shifted. The wrong shoulder forward, weight on the wrong foot, as though his return was a reconstruction from a description, rather than a continuation of the same physical moment. He went to his knees. He was bleeding from both nostrils, and from a split along the inside of his lower lip. His eyes were open but not tracking. We got him out of the harness and out of the facility. We got him to a hospital in Baton Rouge, where a doctor who asked too many questions ran an MRI that showed nothing abnormal and gave us discharge paperwork at 2 in the morning. Sands said almost nothing during this time. He stared at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has looked at something that doesn't fit in the available space and is still trying to rearrange the furniture. Take the harness with us. This was the first decision that committed us to everything that followed. Dr. Orrin Raymond was a professor at a small university in Lafayette who had spent 30 years publishing papers that his colleagues found professionally embarrassing, and that turned out, in the aggregate, to be approximately correct. He studied applied physics with a secondary specialty in materials science and a sideline interest in xenogeology that had cost 2 grants and 1 department chair, who'd eventually retired and left him to his work. Raymond was 61 years old, white-haired, compact, with the alert stillness of a man who has learned to save his energy for the moments when it matters. He met us in his office, which was organized in the specific way of a man who knows exactly where everything is and has not cleaned it in several years. And he looked at the harness for 40 minutes without touching it. Then he found the crystal and removed it with a pair of lab tongs. He worked in silence. He was a man who thought through his hands, adjusting instruments, repositioning samples, making small precise movements that organized his thinking as much as his work. San and I sat against the wall and watched him. George stood near the door. The laboratory smelled of isopropyl alcohol and old books and whatever is in the air of rooms where careful people have done careful work for a long time. He identified the crystal inside of 2 hours. Lunar origin. He was certain before he finished his first analysis, and more certain after his second. The isotopic signature of the crystal placed its formation in the lunar mantle. A geological context that doesn't exist on Earth, that can't be faked with any process he could construct in a laboratory, and that matched in its trace element profile no known sample from any Apollo mission or any subsequent lunar return program. It was not a piece of the moon brought to Earth through normal means. It was not a meteorite. The crystal's internal structure showed evidence of processing. Deliberate shaping of its lattice at the molecular level. The kind of precision that implied not just tool use, but a sophisticated understanding of the material's properties, at scales that human technology had not reached when the crystal was, by his estimate, manufactured. He said the word "fafuxored" and looked at me for a long moment. Then someone knocked on his laboratory door. The knocking had an insistence that we all felt before we could have articulated why. A rhythm that was too regular, too patient, too aware of the pauses between sounds. Raymond opened the door. The man in the corridor was wearing a gray suit and holding a printed flyer. He handed the flyer to Raymond without speaking and walked away. The flyer was for a lecture hosted by something called the Church of the Selenian Accord, a religious organization I'd seen referenced in passing since some of the Atchafalaya Basin background research George had done, dismissed by most sources as a fringe millennial cult of the 2012 prophecy variety. Growing fast but not large, structured in the hierarchical way of organizations that have resources without wanting their resources examined. The flyer's design was clean and expensive. The lecture topic was listed as, "The Moon Has Always Known Your Name." We did not attend the lecture. We went instead to the nearest public address for the church's local chapter, a converted office building on a commercial strip, and I sent San and our second camera operator to film the exterior, while George and I tried to arrange an interview. The interview did not happen. And odds was that 3 men in gray suits emerged from the building, identified themselves as representatives of the church's directorate, and demanded the return of what they called their navigation device. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about. The man in the center of the 3 smiled at me, in the way that people smile when they've made a decision about you that they have not yet chosen to announce. He said, "You have 12 days." He said it in the tone of a man reading a fact from a ledger. Then they went back inside. San and our second operator had caught the encounter on camera and flagged us through the earpiece. We had started back toward the truck when the 3 men emerged again and followed us into the parking lot, not running but moving with the deliberate efficiency of people who don't need to run, because they've already performed the arithmetic of available exits. We got to the truck and pulled out before they reached us. San, watching from around the corner of the building, made it to his car and followed. They chased us for 6 blocks before it became clear they were not going to stop. I got on the radio with San and told him to converge at the interstate on-ramp. He told me he was already there. I drove a red light at the intersection of 2 state routes and heard the gray-suited men's vehicle behind me downshift and accelerate. Then I heard it stop. I pulled over a quarter-mile past the intersection and got out to look. The gray-suited men's vehicle was sitting in the center of the road, not pulled over, not positioned at any angle that a moving vehicle would achieve by braking. It was simply stopped, perpendicular to nothing, in a way that suggested it had ceased participating in the physical logic of roads. As I watched, it rose, not fast, not dramatically. It lifted off the asphalt with the unhurried confidence of a thing that has always been capable of this, and sees no particular reason to conceal it. And it moved southeast at an altitude of approximately 40 feet, until I lost it against the tree line. I stood on the shoulder of that road for a long time. We went to ground in a rental unit outside of Opelousas. It was a 2-room unit in a complex that rented by the week, and had the institutional feel of a place built specifically to hold people in transit. No picture books on the walls, beds with frames bolted to the floor, a kitchenette with a microwave and a coffee maker, and nothing else. I have stayed in worse. The relevant quality of the place was that it was not our homes, which were presumably being watched, and that it was paid for in cash, which was the only currency we'd been using since the Shreveport extraction. We had 4 cameras between us. San had his standard rig. Our second operator, Nate, had a smaller unit. I had a pocket camera that I'd been carrying out of habit for 6 years. The kind of habit you develop when your profession teaches you that the moment you stop recording is frequently the moment something happens. George had nothing. He was a radio man, and he sat with his hands on the table and talked through everything we'd seen in the systematic way of a man who chariots his thinking because narration is how he makes sense of things. George called the radio station and got no answer. He called his producer and got no answer. He drove to the station the next morning and found it closed, the parking lot empty, the front door sealed. Raymond's office phone rang through to a university administrator who told him the professor was on unscheduled leave. George put his hand on the dashboard of my truck and said, quietly, that he believed they were gone. He did not specify what gone meant. He didn't need to. San said nothing about any of this. He sat with his camera in his lap and turned it on and off in a pattern that was not mechanical, not boredom, not habit. He was reviewing footage, I realized. He was watching the 4.3 seconds, frame by frame, trying to reconstruct what had happened to him. He never told me what he found. He set the camera down eventually and looked out the window at the parking lot of the rental complex and at the afternoon light on the asphalt and said nothing. The note arrived under the door of the rental unit on the 3rd morning. A single card, white stock, black ink, an address in Shreveport, a time and in Davengere we almost didn't go. San made the argument clearly. We were being led. We had been led since the box arrived at George's station. And every step towards the next piece of the story was also a step further into an architecture that someone else had built around us. He was right. I knew he was right. I also knew that if I turned away from the address on that card, I would spend the remainder of my life reconstructing tape of what I'd refused to see, and that the reconstruction would be worse than whatever was waiting in Shreveport. Davengere was in his 60s, perhaps older. The kind of age that becomes imprecise in a man whose face has been reorganized by experience. He was sitting in a folding chair in the center of a room that held nothing else except a floor lamp and an ashtray that had seen recent use. He had the bearing of a man who has rehearsed this conversation many times over many years and is finally grateful to be giving it. He had been born on the moon. He laid that down like a foundation stone and then waited for the structure to settle before he built on it. He was not a mystic. He used the word born with the clinical precision of a man describing a procedure he'd read about in the documentation. He had been born in a facility on the lunar far side. A city, really, though city understated the scale of it, that had been established by human beings from what he described as the deep future, a temporal remove so large from our present that the civilization who'd built it bore approximately the same relationship to us that we bear to the populations of the Bronze Age. They had not come from space. They had come from time, and they had built their city on the moon, because the moon was the one location in the solar neighborhood that could hold a structure of that scale. Without attracting the attention of the entities that were, by the period of the moon city's construction, monitoring Earth continuously, he said. You need to understand who is watching. He called them the Outer Accord. Coalition, not a single species, not a single biology, but a confederation of spacefaring civilizations that had, over the course of roughly 2,000 years, established a monitoring protocol for inhabited worlds in what they classified as pre-space flight developmental stages. Earth was on this list, had been on this list since the Accord's earliest records, which they maintained, with the obsessive completeness of an organization that has decided record-keeping is the primary virtue. Earth, inhabited, carbon-based, pre-space flight, Category 4 developmental. No registered fleet assets, no off-world infrastructure, harmless scheduled for first contact reconsideration no earlier than the 26th century, by Accord reckoning. The Accord was not malicious. This was important, Jer said. He said it twice, and both times he leaned forward in his chair, as though the weight of the clarification required physical emphasis. They were not a conquering force, Chip. They were a bureaucratic force, which is different and in some ways more difficult to fight. Because bureaucracies don't have vulnerabilities the way that armies do. They have procedures. They have classification systems. They have the deeply held institutional belief that what has been recorded is what exists, and what is not in the record cannot exist, and therefore need not be considered. Earth had no fleet assets in the Accord's record. Earth had no off-world infrastructure in the Accord's record. Earth was, in the Accord's record, alone and unarmed and waiting like everything else at its developmental stage to be eventually noticed. The city on the moon had been there for 6,000 years. Jer described it in the way you describe something you grew up in, with the casual familiarity that makes a thing sound ordinary, even when nothing about it is ordinary. The city was built into the far side basalt, kilometers down in chambers that the geological survey instruments of any civilization at Earth's current level couldn't reach, and that the Accord's passive monitoring didn't bother to attempt because there was no record of anything being there. It housed, at the time of his birth, a population of approximately 40,000. It had been as large as twice that. It had been as small as 900 in the early periods when the engineering was still being stabilized and the life support redundancies hadn't been fully multiplied out. It was the nerve center of what the moon's inhabitants called the Atlantis Protocol, a long game, played across millennia, in which the moon city's population had slowly, carefully, methodically positioned humanity to be something other than what the Accord's record showed. Not in open defiance, not in visible ways. Treat, in the quiet, patient, procedurally invisible ways that are possible when you can see the timeline from above. The green crystal was the mechanism. It existed only once, across all possible versions of the timeline. This was its property, not a design feature, but a physical law of whatever process had created it. Somewhere in the deep future, in a physics laboratory, whose relationship to our current best understanding of particle behavior is the relationship of a cathedral to a lean-to. Because it existed only once, it was the rarest object in any possible version of history. And because it was the rarest object in any possible version of history, it was the foundation of the timekeeping system that the Moon City used to manage its operations. Without the crystal, the harnesses didn't work. The time path systems couldn't maintain coherence. The whole architecture of the protocol went dark. This was why they wanted it back. Not the gray-suited cultists. They were Earthsiders who believed, more or less correctly, in the Moon City's existence, and had built a theology around it, but they were instruments rather than principles. The principles were the Moon City's own governance, called the Directorate, who had been, Jer told us, making increasingly urgent requests through their Earthside representatives, since the harness had been removed from the swamp facility. The Directorate needed the crystal back before December 21st, 12 days from the call, 11 days from the box, 9 days from where we sat in that Shreveport room. On December 21st, the Outer Accord's monitoring station, a deep space array that had been parked at the L2 point for the last 217 years, part of their standard Category 4 surveillance infrastructure, was scheduled to perform its bicentennial comprehensive scan of the Earth-Moon system. A full-spectrum survey, far more thorough than the passive monitoring it ran the rest of the time. The kind of scan that would, for the first time in the Accord's long observational record, reach the far side basalt to the depth required to image what was there. The Accord was about to see the city. The city's leadership had been preparing for this moment for 40 years. They were not, Jer was careful to specify, unprepared. The city's existence would be, at last, impossible to conceal, and the Directorate had decided. After the kind of debate that lasts decades, that burns through several generations of leadership, that leaves scars in the institutional culture visible long after the specific arguments have been forgotten, that concealment was not the goal, which had always been the goal. From the first generation who built the first chamber 6,000 years ago, was to be seen only when ready. Ready meant fleet assets. Ready meant operational infrastructure across the inner system. Outposts on the Martian moons, monitoring stations threaded through the asteroid belt. In positions the Accord's records didn't show because they were installed under cover of natural objects. and never registered with any body that the Accord recognized as having registration authority. Ready meant a population that had been, for 6,000 years, specifically selecting for the traits that made humanity what it was in the worst possible circumstances. Adaptable, stubborn, creative under pressure, capable of acts of generosity and acts of violence in proportions that no other species the Accord had ever catalogued had managed to maintain simultaneously. Ready meant the harness. Ready meant the crystal. Ready meant the time path system functioning, because the protocol's final phase required precision, and precision required the crystal, and the crystal was sitting in a padded case under Sand's seat in the truck outside. Jer said, "I need you to understand what the Accord is going to see," he said it quietly. He had been quiet through most of this, the quietness of a man who has held something enormous for a very long time, and is finally setting it down in front of someone else. The Accord was going to scan a moon they had been watching for 200 years, and classified as geologically inert, atmospherically negligible, inhabited only by the gravitational residue of an impact 4 billion years prior. They were going to run that scan with the institutional confidence of an organization that has never once, in its 2,000-year history, found anything in a Category 4 system's local bodies. Because Category 4 civilizations don't have the capability to put anything in their local bodies. Because that's what Category 4 means. Jer paused. He was choosing words. He'd spent 50 years building a life on Earth. And in that life, he'd learned how to talk to people who didn't have 6,000 years of context to draw on. He'd gotten very good at it. He said, "Imagine you are an organization that has cataloged 10,000 worlds. That has classification systems with 17 gradations. That has filing protocols and registration databases and review cycles that run on schedules measured in decades. Imagine that your records have never once been wrong about a Category 4 world, that every single one of them, without exception, was exactly what it looked like from the outside. Spaceflight, pre-organized, primitive in the precise technical definition that the Accord used, which was generous and without malice, but was still the word primitive, was still the word applied to a species that had not yet learned to leave its own gravity well. You have been watching Earth for 200 years. Your instruments are state-of-the-art. Your analysts are among the most experienced in the Accord service, and everything they have seen for 200 years has been exactly consistent with Category 4 classification. The space around Earth's moon, empty, the moon's surface, geologically unremarkable, the moon's interior, inert basalt to whatever depth your passive monitoring reaches. Now, you run the bicentennial comprehensive scan, and you reach deeper than your passive monitoring reaches, and the rock is not there. The rock has been replaced, not replaced, built around, built through, built into, by a city and a fleet. A city and a fleet that are filed with your own registration authority, in your own format, using your own codes. A city and a fleet that have been, by the documentation attached to the registration filing, in continuous operation for 6,000 years. He let that settle for a moment, he said. The thing that will stop them in their tracks is not the size of the fleet. It is the filing. No species in the Accord's entire 2,000-year history has ever filed registration paperwork before revealing a military capability. The sequence is always capability revealed, negotiation forced, terms established, registration completed under duress. The sequence has never been paperwork filed correctly, capability revealed, record presented, nothing aimed at anyone. The Accord will not know what procedure to follow. Their procedural frameworks don't have a classification for this. They will have to invent one. And inventing one will take time, and time means that the first conversation happens on terms the city chose, rather than terms the Accord imposed. They were going to find a city of 40,000. They were going to find a fleet of 312 warships, built over 6,000 years in the deep interior, designed specifically around the Accord's known sensor limitations, armed with weapons derived from physics that the Accord's most advanced member civilizations had not yet reached because the deep future's best understanding of physics had been selectively transferred to the Moon City. Across 6,000 years of protocol operations, 312 warships, not large by the Accord's standards of capital ship construction, compact, dense, fast in a way that the Accord's models of achievable propulsion didn't accommodate, which meant that for the first several minutes of any engagement, the Accord's tactical computers would be generating numbers that didn't make sense, feeding those numbers into doctrinal frameworks that assumed a maximum velocity the human ships weren't observing, and spending the combat decisive window trying to correct for instrument error rather than updating their threat assessments. This was the trick, not the fleet, not the weapons. The trick was that the Accord was going to spend opening moments of first contact with humanity's warships, telling themselves that their instruments were malfunctioning, because the instruments had never seen anything like this, and malfunctioning was more consistent with their records than the alternative. We'd had 6,000 years to think about how they thought. They'd had 200 years of watching nothing. Jer looked at the case under San's arm where San had carried it in without being asked. Because San always knew when to carry the equipment, he said. The crystal needs to get home from before the 21st, not for the fleet. The fleet is ready without it. For the record. The time path system maintains the historical record of the protocol's operations. Every insertion, every correction, every adjusted moment in 6,000 years of steering human history toward this particular December. Without the crystal, the record is unverifiable, and the record is the argument. He meant the argument the Directorate intended to make to the Accord in the hours after the scan revealed what was waiting on the far side. Not a military argument, a procedural one, the oldest, densest, most thoroughly documented case in the history of any civilization's interaction with any other civilization. Here is what we built. Here is when we built it. Here is the 6,000-year record of every decision made by a species that your records classify as pre-spaceflight and harmless and scheduled for eventual condescension. Here is what pre-spaceflight looks like from the inside. Here is what harmless chose to become when it thought no one was watching. Here is the fleet. I sat with all of that for a while. The floor lamp buzzed. The ashtray was cold. Had stopped taking notes 40 minutes ago and was staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has found the story that ends all stories and is not sure this is something to be grateful for. San said, "Who are you actually?" Jer looked at him. He looked at him for a long time. He said, "I left the moon when I was 9 years old. I came to Earth because I believed at 9 years old that the city was wrong. I believed that humanity's right relationship to time was to live in it, not above it. I spent 50 years on Earth, became a doctor, a private citizen, a man who did not attend the church's meetings, and who returned their calls after a considerable delay. I built a life here." He looked at the crystal through the case's padded side. Not quite at it, but toward it. "The way you look at something you haven't decided about yet," he said. "I still believe the city was wrong about many things. I believe they were right about this one. Problem was the Directorate's founder, a man named Janus Heron, who had been the architect of the protocol's first phase, and who had, at some point in his tenure, made the decision that had haunted the city's leadership ever since. Heron had used the crystal and the harness to achieve biological continuity. Not immortality in any mystical sense, but in the precise clinical sense of a man who had modified his own cellular processes using a detailed understanding of human genetics that the crystal's time path system gave him access to. He had then spent the subsequent 6,000 watching the protocol he'd built operate, adjusting it where it needed adjustment, grieving the losses that accumulated in 6,000 years of steering history, and eventually arriving at a state of mind that even his most loyal successors found difficult to characterize as stable. He was still alive. He was the Directorate's CEO, in the sense that he retained the founding authority that no subsequent governance structure had found a way to fully supersede, and he had, in the last several decades, become convinced that the protocol had been a mistake. Not strategically, not in its details, but at the level of first principle. He believed that no civilization had the right to edit the history of another, regardless of the reason. He believed that the Accord's arrival should be met not with the fleet, but with disclosure, full and unilateral, of everything the protocol had done, every altered moment, every adjusted life. He believed that the only morally defensible position was to dismantle, on the day of the scan, the 6,000-year project that he himself had built. And he had the authority to attempt it, which was why the Directorate's Earthside representatives were chasing a crystal through the Louisiana Bayou, not because the fleet needed it, but because without the time path system's complete record, Heron's disclosure would be an accusation without evidence, an admission without context, the kind of confession that destroys without explaining. And the Accord would have, in the first hours of learning that humans existed at a military scale it had never imagined, nothing to counterbalance the admission of 6,000 years of timeline manipulation, except the sight of 312 warships. Fleet without the record was a threat. The fleet with the record was a history. These are not the same thing. And the difference between them, in the opening hours of humanity's introduction to the Accord, would determine what kind of relationship followed for the next several thousand years. Jer said, "You have the crystal. You understand what it is. I cannot tell you what to do with it. You're journalists. You went looking for a story. You found the story at the end of all stories, and you're sitting in a room in Shreveport with it in a padded case. This is your choice." I thought about George's radio show, about the caller who'd been cut off mid-sentence, who'd known and had chosen to say it into an open mic at 1 a.m., rather than go to his grave with it. I thought about the photograph of the man in the blazer, smiling, who would walk into a room 12 days later and pick up this crystal with glowing green eyes. I thought about San in the harness, the 4.3 seconds the way his body had come back with its angles wrong. I thought about the city on the moon. 40,000 people, 6,000 years. A fleet built in the dark, inside a world that the galaxy had written off as empty. I thought about what it means to be the species that everyone underestimates. The species that doesn't build its warships where anyone can see them. The species that bides its time across geological ages, and still, somehow is ready, I said. We need to meet Heron. This required the church's cooperation, which required Jer to make a phone call that he made with the careful reluctance of a man who has spent 50 years maintaining a distance, and is now closing it in one evening. The meeting was arranged for the following morning, in the same way that the most consequential meetings are always arranged. Quickly, quietly, and with the particular tension of two parties who have agreed to talk before they've agreed on anything else. Heron met us in a hotel conference room. He was tall, lean, wearing a suit that fit him in the specific way of clothing purchased for a body that had not changed in a very long time. His face was difficult to date. Not young, not old. Somewhere in the space between that the body occupies when it has stopped making the decisions that age it. He sat across off the table from me and folded his hands and looked at me with eyes that had been looking at things for 6,000 years and had in that time learned to show very little. He said he knew why we were there. I told him that Jer had asked us to return the crystal. I said it plainly. I didn't frame it as a request or a recommendation. I said, "Your own founder, the man who built the thing you're trying to dismantle, has asked us to give it back to the operation you created." Heron was quiet for a while. Around us, the hotel conference room did what hotel conference rooms do. Hum of climate control, light through drop seat ceiling, the faint pressure of carpet that has absorbed 20 years of anxious human negotiations. Outside, Baton Rouge was going about its morning, he said. David James is a man who left the city when he was 9 years old and built a very comfortable philosophy out of his absence. He has the luxury of perspective that only distance provides, I said. He also told us what you're trying to do, and why. Heron looked at me, he said. "Do you know what 6,000 years of watching looks like from the inside?" Turret. I told him I didn't. He said, "It looks like knowing that the outcome is right, and that the method was necessary, and that the method was still wrong. These three things can all be true simultaneously. The outcome doesn't redeem the method. The necessity doesn't erase the cost." I sat with that. It was an honest thing to say. It was the kind of honest that cost something. George shifted beside me. He was not recording. We'd agreed on this, and Heron had not asked for it, which itself said something about the kind of man he was. George had his hands on the table and was watching Heron with the expression of a man who has conducted thousands of interviews and knows when he is in the presence of someone whose story is larger than any question he could ask. I said, if you disclose without the record, the Accord sees the fleet first. What do you think happens next? He didn't answer immediately. I said, you spent 6,000 years building an argument. The argument is that humanity is not what the Accord's record says it is. Shh. You can't make that argument without the record. Without the record, the argument is a threat assessment, he said. Very quietly, I know, I said. Then what is this about? He was silent for a long time. Long enough that George shifted in his chair, and the camera operator moved the focus to catch Heron's face in better light. When he spoke, it was slowly, with the care of a man choosing words from a vocabulary of 6,000 years for an audience of 36 years, he said. It's about whether the cost of being right is the same as the cost of being wrong. I built this because I believed it was necessary. I watched it operate for 6,000 years, and I know what it cost. Not in the aggregate, not in the historical abstraction, but in the specific. The specific is very heavy. I wanted, at the end of it, to stand in front of whatever authority there is and say, here is what we did, here is all of it. Without the record's selective presentation, without the argument that makes it defensible. I wanted to say it plainly and let them decide. I said, the record doesn't make it defensible. That's not what it does. Record makes it comprehensible. Those aren't the same thing, you know that. You spent 6,000 years in an operation built on the distinction between what is defensible and what is necessary. Something shifted in his face. Not much. Not visibly. Not in a way that anyone who hadn't been watching him for the last hour would catch. Something settled. The way the last degree of tension leaves a cable that's been pulled too hard for too long. Looked at Jer, who had been standing at the back of the room. Jer met my eyes and gave me nothing. Not a signal, not a prompt. He'd meant it when he said the choice was mine. The padded case on the table, and opened it. The crystal sat in the foam insert and threw green light on Heron's face, and on my hands, and on the conference table, and on the wall behind him, where a generic landscape painting absorbed the light and gave back nothing. I said, make the argument, make it with everything. Not because it makes what you did defensible. You're right that it doesn't, because without it, the first thing the galaxy learns about us is that we have 300 warships aimed at them, and we have 0 words. Make the argument with 6,000 years of record behind it. Tell them exactly what you did and why and what it cost, and let them decide. Heron looked at the crystal for a long time. Then he reached across the table and picked it up. He held it in both hands, and the green light ran up through his fingers and across the bones of his hands in the way that light behaves inside a living structure, reading the routes the blood takes. His eyes behind the glass of his sunglasses pulsed once. Green and certain and impossibly old, he said. All right. That was 9 days before December 21st. I don't have clean access to what happened on December 21st, and I want to be honest about that. What I have is Jer's account, given to us in a final meeting 2 days before, and George's technical analysis of the signal anomalies his radio equipment caught on that morning, and the news footage that emerged in the weeks after. Images that the net framed as atmospheric disturbances and sensor artifacts, and which bore no relationship to atmospheric disturbances or sensor artifacts. The Accord survey array executed its bicentennial scan at 0347. It reached the far side basalt. It imaged what was there. I don't know what the scan showed the Accord's analysts in the first seconds. I know what it showed them in the aggregate, because the Accord's response, which became visible over the following weeks in ways that Earth's monitoring infrastructure could partially resolve, was not the response of an organization that had seen a military threat. It was the response of an organization that had received a very large document and was reading it carefully. The record ran to 6,000 years. The argument was the length of human history. The city sent it all. 312 warships sat in formation on the far side, where the Accord's sensors could see them clearly. And none of them moved. And none of them powered their weapons. And none of them broadcast anything except the coordinates of their position, which was a protocol the Accord recognized as the standard notification format for a registered fleet, declaring its location to a monitoring authority. The city filed the notification in the Accord's own format. using the Accord's own registration codes, which they had acquired 6,000 years ago through time-path operations, and had been updating with each revision of Accord protocol ever since. The warships were registered. The city was registered. Earth was no longer Category 4. Don't know what category it became. I know that the gray-suited men stopped appearing. I know that Dr. Raymond and George's producer eventually returned, neither of them particularly forthcoming about where they had been. I know that the Church of the Selenian Accord quietly dissolved itself over the following 3 months, its leadership having apparently received information that rendered the organization's function obsolete. I know that the man from the Polaroid walked into the conference room in the minutes after Heron left it, picked up the camera I'd left on the table, and looked into the lens with green eyes and a smile that managed somehow to be both 5,000 years old and genuinely warm. He set the camera down. He left the room. I have the footage. Jer died in January, 6 weeks after the scan. He died of what his hospital records listed as cardiac failure, which was accurate and incomplete. His heart stopped because the biological systems that had maintained it through 60-odd years of a life he'd built for himself had reached the end of what they'd been allocated. He died in his own bed, which is what he wanted, in a city he'd chosen, on a planet he'd loved. I was told this by a woman who had been his neighbor for 30 years and who described him as a quiet man who kept a small garden and who sometimes, in the evenings, sat on his porch and looked up at the moon with an expression she'd never been able to name. I understand the expression now. I've worn it myself on clear nights since all of this ended. It's not nostalgia. It's not longing. It's the look of someone who knows what is up there. Who knows it in the bones. The way you know the face of someone you've loved for a long time in a dark room. And who is simply acknowledging the knowledge. 6,000 years, 312 warships, 1 crystal. 1 argument made in full, without apology, to the oldest and most extensive bureaucratic coalition in the known galaxy. We had been here all along. We had been building all along. We had looked at the galaxy that thought it knew us, that had filed us, classified us, scheduled us for eventual pity. And we had decided, not in anger, not in fear, but in the quiet, deliberate way of a species that understands patience at the cellular level, to build our answer in the one place they weren't looking. The galaxy underestimated us. Not because they were foolish, because we are very, very good at being underestimated. I think about that on the clear nights. I think about the 9-year-old boy who left because he thought the city was wrong, and the 6,000-year-old man who let go of a 6,000-year grievance because a 36-year-old journalist told him to make the argument. I think about San, who still doesn't talk about the 4.3 seconds, and George, who went back to his radio show and has never once mentioned any of this on air, and Raymond, who returned to his papers and his students and his marginally embarrassing research, and who, I suspect, understands more of it than any of us. I think about the fleet, sitting still on the far side, pointing nowhere, registered, with an authority that didn't know they existed until 12 days before a deadline that had been circled on a calendar for 40 years. We didn't fire a shot, we filed the paperwork. That's the part that stays with me. That's the part that, when I'm trying to explain to someone what it felt like to be in that room, with the crystal and the 6,000-year-old man and the choice. That's the part that explains what it is to be human. To really be human. In the oldest and most specific sense of the word, we will build the fleet. We will learn the physics. We will plan across timeframes that make galaxies nervous. And when the moment comes, when the scan finally reaches far enough, and the record is finally long enough, and the argument is finally complete, we will hand it over, properly formatted in the correct registration codes, and we will let them decide. Because we were always going to let them decide. We just wanted to make sure we were ready before they looked.